Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a real pleasure to welcome to the program Tracie McMillan. She's the editor at Capital in Maine, covering worker organizing, author of The White Bonus, 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America. Tracie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we should say this is your second book. The American Way of Eating was fascinating. And I don't know if I interviewed you about that. I mean, I can't remember anything that's, but it's a fascinating book. You worked undercover at Walmart and Applebee's, and I can't, maybe
Indeed.
one or two other places. And
Industrial farm fields.
yes. And I want to talk about how that, your experience in that book informed this one. But before we get there, let's just start with, like, what's the difference between white bonus and white privilege? Because we've had like I mean, this book is very different than, I think, the idea of what was it?
Of course, white fragility comes to mind as, you are a white woman writing a book about racism. And I have a lot of problems with that book, White Fragility, which I feel like your thesis really corrects.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, white fragility, I think, really takes sort of a more emotional and individual approach to the question of racism and sort of how it affects white folks. And for me, the white bonus, certainly it's a variation on white privilege, but this is much more looking at the structural sort of trickle down of white privilege, and particularly white supremacy in policy and practice, and how that sort of shows up in individual white folks' lives, right? So the white bonus is not social science. This is just sort of going person by person and saying, okay, well, like, let's look at what your financial life looks like, when your family's been able to help you, when you've had doors opened for you. And then let's look at what social science and sort of history can tell us about whether that experience might have been shaped by sort of racism in favor of white folks, right? So
let's talk, because you wrote an editorial, I think it was in the wake of Trump's election, or certainly around that time. And I think that was in part informed by your experience in that first book you wrote, and just some of your work in general. And the sense of aggrievement that was out there, and how that gets displaced. And I guess maybe even the broader question of, I'm broke, or, I got a huge student debt, or, my family came from nothing, and everything I got was handed, was I had to work for. Talk about sort of like that general notion about deserving and the aggrievement that sometimes gets shifted from the actual sources in which it is being generated.
Yeah. So when I was working on the American Way of Eating, right, there were sort of 2 ways that really shaped my thinking that created the white bonus. One was doing the night shift at Walmart, right, in Michigan, which is my home state, right? So I'm a kid of the Rust Belt. And, that was really the first time as an adult I'd had a chance to sit and study, what opportunity looked like for folks who were basically in the same boat as my grandparents had been, right? So they have sort of like the education you can get for free from government, trying to get by. And, up until the time when I was graduating high school, you really could just get by with a high school education, walk into a factory, and have a stable middle-class life, right? And that has disappeared in that community, right? And so I was sort of on the front lines of watching what that was like for folks. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for broke white people to be aggrieved. It's just that I don't think it really has anything to do with sort of racism suddenly not working. I mean, suddenly working against white folks, or because Black or brown folks are taking their jobs, right? That's not what's happening. And then more specifically, moving towards the white bonus, I had to, in the other jobs I had as a farm worker and as a restaurant worker, right? I was always in those workplaces, I was the only white woman in the workplace. And so to write about that experience, I had to really study how my race and my gender were affecting my experience in those jobs. So those were very poorly paid jobs, but I did notice that I often got given little benefits of the doubt and little sort of boosts up that put me in a different position than most of my coworkers. And so that really led me to be like, well, I do wonder what I get for being white. And in particular, at this point, is it worth it, right? Like when white folks stay quiet about racism, or when we sort of take the things that it gives us, right, there's always a trade-off. And so I think increasingly there's a question for me about whether or not it's worth being silent for.
How much do you think there's an awareness? I mean, we're going to go through the various, and your family is one of the five really that you sort of, part ethnography, part memoir, and I think sort of like this sort of structural project. But how much do you think there is an awareness, broadly speaking, of the existence of this bonus? I mean, to even make that decision of like, am I getting, because there's an element of your book that reminds me of Susan Lemetler's Submerged State, which talks about like sort of the benefits that people get from government that they're not necessarily aware of, if that makes any sense. Like I've never taken a thing from the government at all, but I do get a huge tax break on my mortgage interest deduction and that type of thing. But how much do you think that there is an awareness across the spectrum, and does that change depending on where you are in the spectrum of how much benefit you accrue based upon being white in this country?
Right. I mean, I don't think there's very much awareness for most white people. I mean, that's sort of the trick of the white bonus, right? Is that it's something that exists and is real, but we never admit that it's there. So there's a general sense, I thought a lot when I was working on the white bonus about the things that I know, but I'm not conscious of. So sort of unknown knowns, right? If you go back to that weird Donald Rumsfeld stuff about what you know and don't know and that whole calculus, right? Because I do think that most white folks have some general understanding that we're supposed to sort of be able to get by, right? And that kind of is on autopilot. And we often don't talk about the ways that, certainly my ability to get by, there's not a lot of direct government policy right now that's targeted explicitly at white folks, but because my grandparents and then later my parents benefited from policies that did explicitly benefit white people, right? That stuff keeps trickling down, right? And keeps opening up. And then as that stuff sort of erodes, as the formal advantages erode, there's still all this stuff where in interpersonal interactions, right, in hiring decisions and decisions about when I'll get housing or not, those things often can open up doors. Being white often opens up doors for me and buys me the benefit of the doubt, right? And so that stuff. But I think most white people don't think about, because we're not taught to think about it, right? We're taught to be colorblind. And so we're told that this aspiration, right, that I think most Americans agree is like a thing to aspire to, as if it's fact when it's not, right? And then, but if we're supposed to be colorblind, then how did I get something for being white, right? Like there's this whole thing where we don't learn very accurate history, don't really learn what government has done for our families and communities because we're white. And then we just sort of go along thinking, oh, this is just what Americans get. But in fact, right, it's often what white Americans get.
And how much does this sort of mirror the concept of white people not having to be aware of race in the way that if you're not white in this country, you simply cannot not be aware of race. I mean, white people is the normal. And I mean, I've said this in the context, maybe a little bit of like the presidential elections, like people went from Obama to Trump, I think to a certain extent were like, particularly men were like, we've had one non-normal president. We're not going to have two in a row. But that idea of like, why do black people always have to bring up race? I think suggests that there is a lack of awareness of how much this is in play at all times.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the whole sort of nexus of white privilege, right? That you don't ever have to think about race. And I think the white bonus stuff, that's really like the structural variation of that white innocence, right? And for me, my longer history as a reporter is as a poverty reporter covering welfare reform in New York City under Giuliani and Bloomberg. And this idea that white folks have never gotten anything from government, right, is completely inaccurate, right? But that's how sort of white folks are raised, even though, I mean, 'cause what happened, right, is the GI Bill and housing discrimination, all these things worked in white folks' favor in mid-century, and then it trickles down. But white folks say, oh, well, the government never helped me. It's just that government just gave grandpa a free college education, right? Gave grandpa an affordable mortgage on a low-cost house, right? And then that stuff comes down because we don't get it directly. We say, oh, that's not about being white. When, I mean, historic records are very clear that that's what it's about.
Well, let's get into that because I think I mean, in the context of your own family, you trace some of those sort of structural advantages that accrue later in life, and we know that one of the single, I think, biggest asset of intergenerational wealth is real estate, and that's the way that intergenerational wealth is built, regardless of how big it is at any given point. Having access to housing in your family history 100 years ago or 75 years ago makes a big difference as to where you're going to be situated today. But let's talk about your family, and you go back two generations, or great grand. You go back generations.
I basically drew the line at 1900. I was like, I don't want to go back further than that. And just because I have one set of grandparents that was a lot older than the other, right? One side of the family goes to great grandparent, one side goes to grandparents.
Okay, and so and walk us through on those both different sides. There's examples on one side of just sort of like of the advantages within the context of a trade, and then on the other side, and the advantages in the context of real estate. I mean, walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So, my family, my dad's side is sort of is like a banker's family, right? And my mom's side is factory workers and blue collar. So on the blue collar side, right, my great grandfather came up from the Ozarks in the early 1900s. So migrant coming up from the South, got a job in a foundry with GM outside of Detroit, which is where a lot of folks landed when they first came up. But unlike black workers, he was promoted out of the foundry and got training as a welder, and was able to sort of move into working at a small business and then opening his own small business. He'd been a renter for a really long time, and then was able to buy a house that was actually built with a racial covenant, right? So none of that wealth in that family really passed on to me just because of the specifics of that family, right? But it did give that side of the family enough stability that then my grandfather in the 1920s was actually attending college when he got drafted into the war. And then he comes back, starts a family, right, and is stable enough with a factory job at Ford to put my mother through college, right, which is where she meets my father, who's the son of a banker. And that side, again, none of that money really trickles down to me. I do document in the book that, my parents had this beautiful wedding in Oakland County, which is the suburban county north of Detroit, on the shores of a lake in this very nice enclave in West Bloomfield. And they're able to do that largely because my factory worker grandfather had just inherited his father's house as part of his father's estate when his dad died, right? And so my mother's beautiful wedding, right, is directly traceable to a racial covenant on the home that my great-grandfather held. Now, the other side of the family, the bankers, right, that's much clearer because that's where money actually trickles down to me, right? That's money that helped me get through college, that helped my parents pay off their mortgage, like gave them a down payment on the first house that they owned, all of that stuff. And so that grandfather, right, became a banker in the 1920s. In the year 1930, there were about 239,000 bankers in the U.S. Only 80 of them were black, right? So highly unlikely grandpa would have been a banker, except that he was white. And then in 1938, he built a house on a lot that had a racial covenant. So he would not have been legally allowed to own or occupy that home if he had not been white, right? So all the sources of that family's wealth that end up trickling down and changing my life, right? That's all contingent on him being white.
When you talk about the banker, I'm remembered the speech that Mitt Romney gave, the one where they secretly taped, and he had said like the takers and the makers. Right. But one thing that people don't remember in that speech he gave, he said that had his father or grandfather, I think it was, who had lived in Mexico. For a while, some Mormons had to go down to Mexico to avoid, I think, like some of the polygamy issues. Had he had Romney's last, Romney said something to the effect like, had my last name been Ramirez, I would already be president. And completely sort of jumping over the fact that like, your last name been Ramirez, your father probably wouldn't have been president of AMC. He probably wouldn't have been governor of Michigan. You probably wouldn't be sitting here after having had, having had to live only off of like a small stock portfolio when you were in college. I mean,
but conservatives like to start the clock whenever is convenient for them, right?
But, yes, I mean, but that idea of like this sense of like I'd have more privilege if I was part of a different class of people is impressive in certain instances.
Right,
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's a really illustrative of one of the reasons why it's so important to start learning how to talk about the white bonus stuff, right? Because that kind of sort of misapprehension only makes sense if you think government never did anything for you, right? If you think that you weren't ever getting anything ever before, right? Because I think this is sort of the root of some of the white grievance that you see, is because we don't ever talk honestly about the fact, government made these investments in white families and white communities and made this white middle class possible. Because we don't ever talk about that, you can sort of see why, somebody who doesn't have the privilege of extraordinary amounts of education would sort of be like, well, why do they get something? Why would we open doors for Black workers or brown workers? Like, I've worked hard, right? If nobody has actually ever told you or educated you about how this country has worked, right? I have some empathy for being like, I can see why, like I've got cousins who are pretty resentful, and I'm like, well, I can kind of see why that would happen. It's just that it's not accurate.
Right. And it's because they're just not aware, or, expand on that, because we should say that as your story develops, your mother passes away in part because of a lack of services that are provided. You ultimately become estranged from your father, who was physically abusive to you before you left home. So there. Talk about those feelings around that notion of like, why do they deserve it, and how, and if we don't get it, because there's both that question of like, there's benefit that government has provided that you're unaware of on some level, but there's also then like, in the absence of that help, sometimes it feels like we're on our own. And if I'm on my own, then why should anyone else not be on their own? In terms of support.
That's a pretty good summary of it. I think, certainly when I've been doing reporting or just sort of engaging with family members, it just, if you don't understand that you've gotten some stuff in the past, right, you don't understand why doors are going to get open for somebody else. And then the other part is that, in part because of white resentment, we have allowed the social safety net to become so ineffective, right? And the sort of the public sector to be so puny that, life is actually really hard for a lot of people, including a lot of white people, right? Like really the lower half of the economy, whatever color you are, it's incredibly difficult, right? And you might get a few sort of smaller advantages here and there because you're white, but, I write about this with my mother, right? So, for folks that haven't read the book, part of what happens with my mom is that we get mired in a lawsuit about who's supposed to cover the costs of her medical care, right? So we're like suing a private insurance company. We can't get Medicaid, so we're sort of in this disaster. And the whole thing just revolves around proving that she deserves this stuff, right? So it makes this horrible mess for my family. It ruins my mother's life. And, we have just such like a hard time as a country, I think, being like, okay, like, when we're talking about equity, so if we take a racial equity lens to that, we're like, well, we want a Black person. How is race working for my mom there? And I'm like, well, probably, she was helped a little bit because, for a little while, she ended up in an adult foster care home that was willing to take her without her paying pending the outcome of the lawsuit. Probably they would be less willing to take a Black person, right? Because of racism, they would be less willing to trust that a Black family would eventually pay off for them for whatever reason, right? But that I mean, so if that's the white privilege, right, that's not worth a whole lot. The problem is not that there's a white advantage there. The problem is that this is such a messed up system, right? So it makes it harder to focus on the problems with the system when we only focus on representation.
I would imagine too that on some level, like, the backdrop and the sort of just the advantages that comes with like being of a banker family and whatnot, just give you a little bit more confidence in trying to navigate that bureaucracy, even if it was ineffective at that time.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Let's talk a little bit about the other families or people that you ended up sort of chronicling and working out here. How did you find these people, and where are they situated, sort of, I guess, economically? Because they all tend to be sort of more or less middle class on some level.
Yeah, so everybody's somewhere in the span of the middle class. Initially, when I was working on the proposal for the book, I thought it would go up and down the class ladder, but it just turned out that I couldn't really get anybody who was either very broke or very rich to talk to me for this book. And I think that that's really indicative of the fact that, for the middle class, like, we understand how easily you can fall and sort of how tenuous our position is. And so I think in the middle class, we're a little more open to being like, well, I kind of want to understand this because we're having some issues here. I found everyone through pretty traditional journalistic methods, right? So one profile, right, Katrina, who's a nurse in Pittsburgh with SEIU, like, I found her through her union. I found a pair of millennial sisters in the public school district for Hattiesburg, Mississippi, just through professional connections who, people who were academics and writers in Mississippi, because I was looking for a Mississippi family.
Why were you looking for a Mississippi family in particular?
I wanted to be in the deep South,
okay,
and to do a piece about education. And I just felt Mississippi is such an iconic place in that story. So to sort of be like, I'm going to dig in, like, exactly where, when people in the North think about school segregation, we think about places like Mississippi. So we'll go there. And then the other two subjects, so we have Barb, who's a boomer woman who ends up dying because she doesn't have Medicaid in Texas. And I knew her family. So Debbie Nathan, her sister is actually a journalist friend of mine. And then Jared, right, who's a young man who gets given a second chance after being sort of going before a judge with charges of dealing narcotics on school grounds, extortion, and larceny, and then goes on to become a homeowner because he gets a second chance. That's also somebody I sort of personally knew and then was able to convince to work with me on the project.
All right, let's start with Katrina. She is working as a nurse, and she gets certain advantages, and you sort of contrast her experience with her friend, who is Black, and you can see the sort of like divergence there that happens. Tell us briefly just about their story.
Sure. And I should say, I had decided to profile Katrina before I knew she had a Black best friend. So this is just sort of happenstance, which I think suggests that this is probably pretty common. So Katrina, right, had started out as a CNA, right? So sort of a lowest paid job in a nursing home, generally speaking, making beds and sort of doing a little work with patients. And she's working at a corporate nursing home. Pretty aimless, right? She's not an ambitious, directed, sort of move forward person. And, the person in HR says, hey, like, you're really good at this. Do you want to get a nursing degree? We have a scholarship program. You should apply. And Katrina's like, well, I don't know. The HR person keeps being like, no, you should really apply. Right. And so Katrina ends up going to nursing school and becoming a nurse, becoming a union leader, right? All because this person in HR was like, hey, Katrina, you should do this. Right. And, occupational segregation in healthcare is very significant, right? Almost, it's a huge proportion of workers at the CNA level are Black and brown. And then the further up you go, the income and status ladder, the whiter it gets. Right. And so Katrina gets sort of put on an escalator, right, that she just sort of can sort of get on and get going. As long as she stays on it, she's going to be fine. Jasmine, meanwhile, as a high school student, figures out to get a CNA license so she can make more money to save for school. And, she goes to the guidance counselor to do that. She's at a mostly white high school. And when it comes time to do college applications, the guidance counselor is pestering all of her white friends saying like, hey, you should apply here and you should apply here and don't give up on college. And when Jasmine asks about going to college to be an RN, the guidance counselor says, oh, well, don't you already have your CNA license? Don't you just want to do that? Right. And kind of discourages her from it. Right. So Jasmine, ends up same sort of income arena as Katrina has, in part because they're both in union jobs, right, which limits sort of the racial disparities in wages. But she has to fight a lot harder, right, to get up into like an RN position.
Let's talk about Lindsay and Marianne Becker. They're members of, I think there were two other siblings in that family, but their experience in going to both the experience of going to a school that is subject to white flight, but also this gifted and talented program, which, back in the day when my daughter was young enough, like I had some experience, and it is even in New York City, there was a similar dynamic. When you walk into the classrooms, you see like, wait, what's going on here? But tell us about this.
Yeah, so Lindsay and Marianne are going to the public schools in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And, their family is a white family. School district there, I think when they entered, was around 80% Black, right? So most of the white families in that community had left the district, right? They were either putting their kids through private school or they had moved entirely out of the city and were going to a county school. Right, as a white family, those parents said, no, we want our kids in this school. There's nothing wrong with it. We don't care if our kids are going to school with Black kids. That's fine. And besides, there's a gifted and talented program. And so we're going to make the most of this program, right? So nationally, I think the average is 8% of white students are put into gifted and talented program. At their elementary school, 42% of the white students were in the gifted and talented program. And the difference was so stark that the Becker's mom, she was like, yeah, pretty much like all the white kids ended up in the gifted and talented program. Like it was a very white space. And if my kids hadn't been in that program, and I believe her when she says she doesn't care about race, like she's a very spiritual person. Like I don't think on a one-to-one level, she carries a lot of prejudice, but she was very clear. Like if my kids were not in that program that was getting the extra resources, we would have moved. Right, we would have figured out going somewhere else. And then, what I do with the two sisters is because the Hattiesburg was going through a transition during their education, right? The older sister, Lindsay, right, she graduates when it's about 20% white district. And she's sort of able to really make use of these targeted resources and get out and get a good scholarship and so on and so forth. But by the time Marianne is coming up through the district about 5 years later, it's really lost a lot of its resources, and she ends up not getting a sufficient education to perform well in college, right? So she's in the gifted and talented, she's in the extracurriculars, she gets a scholarship to a liberal arts school up north, and then she gets into classes and realizes she can't write, and she ends up, dropping out, coming back home and sort of going on a very different path from her sister.
What happened? What was it that caused those resources to be drained from the gifted and talented program there?
Right. Well, a lot of it was the white flight, right? Because it wasn't just people leaving the schools, it was people leaving the county. And so taking their tax dollars into the next district. And then as you saw that white flight leaving, the businesses also left. And interestingly, this is unusual, Hattiesburg straddles two counties. So they would just go over the county line. So they'd still be in Hattiesburg City. So they still get all the municipal services, but all the taxes for schools are going to the county school. Right. And so you had like a massive shopping mall develop on the far side of the city out there. And so all of the taxes from that retail are going to support the county school where all the white students have moved to. And interestingly, that county district now, because middle class Black families figured out that was a much better education, they started moving out there. And as that school has become increasingly integrated, now you see white families moving to a district like sort of north in the county, right? So you're sort of seeing this shift happen again.
Oh, so it's just I mean, that makes it even more explicit, right? That it's just the presence of Black students that are driving white people out. It's no longer a function of like, the school is not good. There doesn't seem to be the same level of pretense that's associated with that.
I mean, I don't think I could get anybody to say that on record, but that is very much the colloquial understanding in the community there, right? That, folks left Hattiesburg and went to Oak Grove, and now the white families are starting to go up to Summerall, right? And that they'll just sort of keep chasing in that way.
The story of Jared, who had issues. He sold some drugs, essentially. It reminded me of Chris Hayes's book, A Colony in a Nation, where he outlined, I think it was, if I remember correctly, like he had some pot in his a jacket that he didn't remember when they were going into like one of the political conventions. Or maybe it was as a kid. I don't know. I may be getting stories mixed up, but it was basically that same story where, like, had he been black when he got caught with whatever it was he was caught with, it would have implicated the rest of his life. In this instance, it was just like the cop saying, like, don't do this again. And that was it. Right. And so there was the similarity. Tell us the story of Jared.
Yeah, so Jared, right, is a skater kid in Connecticut in the 90s. And, his parents were divorced. He spent a lot of time by himself. And he got in with some kids where he had a friend who was like the weed dealer. And Jared was like, well, I'll be the LSD guy, right? I'll be the acid guy. So he buys a sheet of hits from like a friend of a friend and then starts taking them to school to sell off. And after a few times of this, he gets caught, right, by the school safety officer, gets arrested. At school, like put into the cop car, like on campus, gets suspended. When he comes back, he goes to the snitch and sort of shakes him down for a little money and kind of threatens him. So ends up with extortion and larceny charges. So by the time he gets before a judge, it's like 1995. His parents have made it to every one of his hearings, right? So they're middle-class folks. They were able to pay for a lawyer for Jared, in part because his dad had been an engineer. So his dad was actually unemployed at the time, but had a 401k, which he had because he'd been an engineer. He'd been an engineer because he had a grad degree. He got the grad degree by working for Kodak up in Buffalo, which I found actually has a long history of sort of charges of employment discrimination, right? So it seems really unlikely Jared's dad would have been on that path if he had been a black man. So Jared, anyway, has sufficient legal support and sort of parental support that he's able to go before the judge at the height of punitive drug policing and just get given sort of like, okay, we're going to suspend your sentence, keep your nose clean, and then do some community service and you'll be fine. And so Jared gets through that, right? And ends up he now works as a public health nurse out in California.
And the point being that this is not something that has, he's not serving time. He's not, he doesn't have some permanent record that inhibited his ability to get jobs, to get loans, to get anything.
Right. And particularly, right, this, in terms of the white bonus, right, this ends up being very valuable, right? So there are all these fees now associated with the criminal justice system and any kind of incarceration. So the things that Jared avoided, right, include like $20,000 in direct fees. He probably would have been charged. And then he was able to earn at least $50,000 roughly in just working minimum wage because he was able to be employed during that time. Right. I didn't even get into calculating the long-term effects on wages and things like that, because so much of that is about sort of veering on a very different path. Right. Because, Jared was very clear with me. He's like, if I had gone to prison at that time of my life, he's like, I would have come out a criminal and I would have kept doing that sort of stuff. He's like, I would have gotten hard. I would not have learned my lesson. Right. And that's, not just like in human capital, just in capital. Right. Like it's very expensive to be incarcerated.
Let's talk. I mean, there's one more story, but people can read the book about that, because I just want to talk a little bit about this. Both, and we should say at the end, you basically tally up the dollar figures on this and work it out. And this, I think you make it clear, like it's not an exact science, but you're probably underestimating on some level, like if someone was to come in and be able to actually assess this. But let's talk about the idea of, like, how we rectify this in a material sense. You bring up solidarity dividends. Walk us through that a little bit.
Right. I mean, well, solidarity dividends, right? This is an idea that I came to know through Heather McGee's work with the Sum of Us, right? Which is sort of the benefits you get when people come together across class and race lines, right? To demand a collective solution to something, and this is something that, I've been in a relatively unique position as an American because I live in rent stabilized housing in New York City, right? And that's been really key to sort of the arc of my life. And that's something that was created by an interracial, group of organizers, like first as rent control and then later as rent stabilization. And so solidarity dividends can be so valuable because they not only like give you benefits, they also alleviate the need for the kinds of stuff that families are often on the hook for, right? Like, so when I'm tallying my white bonus in the book, it's mostly cost of education, some help with housing, things like that, things that I wouldn't need from my family so much, right? If we did a better job of supporting that collectively as a public, right? And so I think for me, the white bonus is really important to be talking about because once I'm honest about the things that I get, I can also look at the things that I have to pay for that what racism is costing me because we're unable to build a sufficient political movement that can demand these things from government.
Will you just once extrapolate a little bit on that concept of how racism inhibits the ability of this universality? Because we've seen this time and time again with programs that get diminished sort of popular support when they're perceived as servicing only non-white people. And we see programs, like you write about the GI Bill in your book. This is available to everyone coming out of the military, except for your dollars are no good here if you're black in 1947, and you're going to the vast majority of colleges in the country.
Right. So, I think in current history, right, like Medicaid is the big example of this, right? So we've got 10 states that have not expanded Medicaid to working age childless adults under the ACA, and the social science is really clear, social science and political science, very clear that is as a result of white racism, like white voters not wanting to support something because they think that Black people are going to benefit from it, right? So that's sort of the clearest one right now. But there's also, really interesting correlations around white voter support for public higher education and sort of the taxes that are required to pay for it, right? It was really instructive to me to look at, during the GI Bill, when it was understood by people in power that everybody using it was going to be white, right? College is free. You get some help with your books, right? You get up to the boomers, like it's a little more diverse, a little less support. You get up to sort of moving towards Gen X, right? And all of a sudden, and you're getting more and more diverse. All of a sudden, like white voter support for public institutions and taxation that leads to things like education tanks, right? So I bring this out in Jared's profile talking about Prop 13 out in California, right? And so now, right, when we have probably the most diverse college-age population that we've ever had in this country, right, you basically have to mortgage your future just to get into the middle class.
The book is White Bonus, 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America. Tracie McMillan, thank you so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.